Before we move forward, please like, share, and subscribe Strategic Vanguard and be up to date with the latest news and happenings from the world of defense, strategic, and international affairs. Tune into our video channels in YouTube and Rumble. And if you want to hear the audio version, tune into our Strategic Vanguard channels in Spotify and Amazon Music.
Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome back to the Duck Dive, where we take those dense geopolitical reports you shared and distill them into the essential knowledge you need. It's your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed. Today we're wading into what our sources are calling a silent but decisive struggle. It's about dominance over the world's most critical maritime waters. We're talking about this huge strategic contest between China and India. It stretches all the way from the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, and, well, right into the Pacific Rim.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here, it isn't just your classic naval race, counting ships and subs. It's deeper. It's about a fundamental difference in how power is projected now in the 21st century. The sources, they show a really clear contrast. China builds infrastructure. Think physical corridors, concrete, steel. While India, on the other hand, builds alliances, diplomatic coalitions based on trust, mutual interest.
That core distinction really seems to define everything on this maritime chessboard. So our mission today is to explore the strategies, the motives behind them, and of course, the long-term consequences of this competition. Because how these two giants interact out there on the water, well, it's going to redefine the global balance of power for you and for everyone else. Let's look at the blueprints.
Okay, starting with China, you have to look at the Maritime Silk Road, the MSR. It was launched back in 2013. It's the sea part of their massive Belt and Road initiative. Basically, Beijing's grand plan to link Asia, Africa, and Europe through interconnected sea routes.
Right. The official line is always, trade, economic development, but you hinted there's more to it. If the MSR isn't just about moving goods, what's the secondary goal? What are the sources saying China is really trying to secure?
Well, fundamentally, the MSR is a tool for strategic leverage. Beijing is trying to weave this dense web of influence, using ports, pipelines, partnerships, stretching right across the globe. From Piraeus in Greece all the way to Gwadar in Pakistan. These projects serve China's critical need for energy security, securing oil and gas flows, obviously. But maybe more importantly, they're expanding its naval and commercial reach far, far beyond its immediate shores. They're essentially building outposts.
And that strategy, it requires just colossal amounts of capital, which, let's face it, China has. But India, its main competitor in the region, doesn't really have that kind of cash to throw around. So how do they even begin to counter this huge economic push?
And that's precisely where the collaborative approach comes in. India's counter strategy, what they call the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's explicitly framed as non-imperial. It's values-driven. They're aiming for a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific. Key phrase there, a region not dominated by any single power. Their whole strategy is about offering an alternative model.
And that collaborative vision, that must be why India aligns so strongly with partners like the US, Japan, Australia, often talked about under the Quad framework, right?
Exactly.
So just to sum up that initial strategic difference, China builds physical corridors, concrete and steel pathways.
Yep.
India builds diplomatic military coalitions.
That comparison is spot on.
Yeah. Okay, let's dig into China's corridors then, because that's where we get some of the most vivid and sometimes controversial parts of their strategy. This is the famous string of pearls idea.
Right, the string of pearls. It basically describes this chain of Chinese-funded ports stretching right across the Indian Ocean. It's designed really to secure Beijing's critical sea lines of communication and also to position logistical hubs strategically.
Okay, give us some specific examples of these pearls and the kind of strategic weight they carry.
Well, there are several key ones. You've got Gwadar in Pakistan. That gives China direct access to the Arabian Sea, potentially bypassing the Malacca Strait, which is a big vulnerability for them. Then there's Hambantota in Sri Lanka. That gives them a strategic vantage point really close to India's southern flank. Very sensitive spot. And maybe the most explicit example is Djibouti in the Horn of Africa. That actually hosts China's first proper overseas military base.
So these aren't just random commercial investments then. It looks like a systematic, very intentional maritime strategy focused on securing energy routes, protecting their interests overseas, and crucially, enabling Beijing to project naval power thousands of miles from home.
And here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the sources reveal the mechanism of how they acquire this strategic position. Debt trap diplomacy. Many countries that get involved in China's MSR projects, they end up facing overwhelming dependency, huge financial exposure.
And the sources always point to Hambantota as the prime example, don't they?
Indeed. It's the classic case study. When Sri Lanka simply couldn't repay the massive loans China gave them for the port development, well, the facility was leased to China for 99 years. But here's the kicker, the real detail. The debt transfer included provisions giving China veto power over the port's commercial decisions. So they didn't just lease the land, they got deep operational control, all under the banner of win-win cooperation. It's a huge amount of geopolitical leverage gained through economic means.
Wow. That debt trap model is, well, it's alarming. It allows China to gain long-term control over really strategic real estate. Okay, let's turn to India's counterbalance. You said their strategy is fundamentally based on infrastructure grants, not highlighting partnership, capacity building, collective security. They can't compete on sheer scale, so they compete on, what, stability, trust?
Exactly. And India's strategy plays out through three core instruments: diplomacy, defense, and development. The 3Ds. In diplomacy, they lean heavily on frameworks like the QA, like you mentioned, but also the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IRA, and lots of Asian outreach, promoting cooperation, not dominance.
And on the defense side, we see that desire for interoperability, working with partners, things like the joint naval exercises, Malabar with the US and Japan, and Milan, which brings lots of regional navies together. They're explicitly designed to create a kind of shared operating manual for the seas, right? So multiple navies can act together.
Precisely. And that connects directly to the third pillar, development. India invests heavily in those infrastructure grants across the Indian Ocean region. They make a point that these projects don't come with those hidden conditions or the kind of paralyzing debt burdens that China sometimes imposes.
And this is all guided by India's core philosophy, right? The Sagar vision.
Yes, Sagar. It stands for security and growth for all in the region. It's a vision that consciously focuses on stability and regional balance. And that makes it much more palatable to smaller nations, the ones who worry about being swallowed up by a single dominant power.
That seems like the key differentiator. India is sort of quietly expanding its maritime footprint through these strategic partnerships, not by setting up huge permanent military bases, which always cause political fallout.
Correct. They're not asking for big sovereign land transfers. Instead, we see agreements for access to facilities, places like Duk in Oman or Chabahar in Iran, though that one's complicated.
So India gets reach without coercion, and that inherent trust, especially from smaller island nations, that seems like a kind of asymmetric strategic advantage, something China's debt trap model just can't easily replicate.
I think that's right. Smaller nations tend to trust New Delhi more precisely because it doesn't impose those hidden, potentially ruinous conditions. When a country accepts an Indian grant, they keep sovereign control. When they accept a massive Chinese MSR loan, well, they risk losing control of the asset itself down the line.
Okay, so we have this dual approach crystallized. China uses infrastructure as influence, India uses alliances as insurance. But where does this competition actually play out? Where are the literal friction points?
It really plays out in the control of critical maritime choke points. This is where the waters become, crucial zones of influence. If you control the choke points, you control the flow of global trade, global energy. It's that simple.
And the most famous, maybe the most vulnerable, is the Malacca Strait, right?
Absolutely. Nearly 80% of China's oil imports pass through that narrow strait. It's incredibly vital, but also incredibly vulnerable for them. That vulnerability, often called the Malacca Dilemma, that's what drives so much of China's MSR strategy, trying to find alternative routes, both land and sea.
And directly countering that, you have India's strategic presence, particularly its naval bases in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, right there in the Andaman Sea. That position allows them to monitor and potentially influence that entire flow of traffic heading towards Malacca. It acts as a huge strategic lever for India.
Huge. And of course, we can't ignore the South China Sea. China's extensive island building, creating artificial islands with military facilities. That gives it incredible leverage over key international shipping lanes there. It effectively pushes the boundary of its naval domain hundreds of miles out.
Now, when we talk naval dynamics, the sheer numbers often come up. China's Navy, quantitatively, it's the world's largest now, by number of ships. They've poured astronomical sums into shipbuilding.
True. The numbers are impressive. But quantity isn't the only metric here. India has critical strengths that sort of offset that volume. Primarily, it's geographic centrality. India sits right astride the key trade and energy routes of the entire Indian Ocean. Location, location, location. Plus, India's own naval modernization is significant. They're investing in aircraft carriers, nuclear submarines, making it a credible blue water power capable of defending its sphere of influence. So you're comparing China's massive quantity with India's, you could say, unbeatable strategic geography and maybe a qualitative edge in certain capabilities.
So looking ahead then, what does this all mean for the region, for the world? Can these two ambitious maritime powers actually coexist? Or is some kind of strategic collision, well, inevitable?
That really is the fundamental question, isn't it? And the answer, based on the source material we've looked at, seems to be conditional. Coexistence is definitely possible. If both nations can keep the focus squarely on mutual economic growth, on regional stability, kind of like India's Sagar vision promotes.
But the confrontation scenario, that remains the high-risk outcome, especially if the MSR continues down its current path.
It does. Confrontation becomes much more likely, maybe not outright war, but certainly intense competition, economic skirmishing, if China continues using the MSR primarily as a geopolitical weapon, prioritizing strategic dominance and leverage over genuine, non-coercive economic partnership.
And that's where other global players like the US, Japan, ASEAN nations come in. Their role seems to be ensuring the Indo-Pacific stays free, open, not controlled by a single hegemon.
Absolutely. The sea, as we've seen, it's both a bridge for trade and potentially a battlefield for influence. And how China and India navigate that duality, whether they choose the path of alliances and trust or the path of infrastructure and coercion, well, that's going to determine the balance of power for the rest of this century.
A compelling thought to leave you with. The next time you see a headline about a new port being financed or built somewhere in the Indian Ocean, maybe ask yourself, is this structure part of a potentially coercive corridor designed to create debt? Or is it a thread in a mutual strategic coalition? The answer tells you a lot about who's shaping the future of the oceans. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.